Book of Hours is determined to remain an essential platform that offers a creative interpretation for lockdown skeptics and experts who have been censored by mainstream press. Thanks to your donations, we can carry on doing this essential work as working artists. These big issues of the day are vital and need to be heard. So please share our videos, subscribe to our YouTube channel, make a one-time donation on our PayPal page, but most importantly, please be a part of our team on our Patreon page. Go to patreon.com/bookofhours and hit the blue button titled Become a Patron. Thank you.
America's past is steeped in class struggle, economic disparity, and racism. But racism wasn't always what it is today, although like today, it was used as a tool to divide poor people and keep them collectively weak. Of course, black slavery, which built much of the United States, including the White House, informed the racism of today and even the racism of the events leading up to the Civil War of the United States. The idea of race, though, didn't happen until European colonizers found that it was a good way to divide humans into categories and profit from those differences. But the story of racism in America was always fueled entirely by economic disparity, with the ruling class pitting poor white people against poor black people, before and after slavery was abolished. Racism has always been a tool used by the wealthy to keep the poor apart from each other and prevent them from banding together to take action against the ruling classes. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a problem in the eyes of the state until he started talking about economic disparity. He wasn't killed because of his civil rights activism. It wasn't until later that he was harassed by the FBI and eventually killed because of his opposition to a war that was fought by poor young men. Poor men, as he pointed out, who were mostly black, but most importantly, who were impoverished and marginalized. The Black Panther movement wasn't targeted by the FBI until after they started programs to feed, educate, and lift up the black community. It was their efforts to bring the black population out of poverty that ultimately brought their attention to J. Edgar Hoover, who launched COINTELPRO, various harassment campaigns, and attacks against the Panthers to bring them down and eliminate their organization and message. Today, we're seeing initiatives and actions to distract all of us from the destabilizing poverty that has been taking place in the U.S. and around the world for years. And it's working. Right now, we're being distracted from the giant economic depression in our midst, as well as what's going on in the background behind the COVID event, behind protests, and behind the calls for reform and defunding of the police. We're not saying that racism doesn't exist. We know it does. Albeit as observers, we've seen it up close through things people say in day-to-day conversations and witnessing verbal mistreatment and physical exclusion. What we thought was especially odd, though, was the recent massive protests that impulsively happened overnight for the sake of one person, when many, many others had occurred before without any participation or outrage from people who weren't part of the black community. It was as if these new events were sponsored in some way, because at the same time this was all happening, we were seeing messages on corporate websites and emails talking about racism when it never was mentioned before by these companies on their platforms.
Were these messages and actions as spontaneous as they seemed? Or were they part of an organized plan to appear to support the black community and stand against racism? to distract us from the poverty that exists and what we're all facing, to divide us as people, and to dilute the message. Every resistance movement and marginalized community action that has taken place for the last 65 years, from civil rights to G20 protests and the Occupy movement, have been brought back to life and re-presented to us through the spectacle of the media. But when we look at what's taking place, if we look closely, there is no reflection of the past in the actions of the present. These movements of the past that were once vilified, suppressed, and killed by the state have been brought back to life, turned into vampires with no reflection, and turned loose on all of us to break apart our lives and suck the life out of our imperfect society, to ensure that it can never be improved, and most importantly, never return. These vampires are now overseeing zombie armies to recruit well-meaning but unsuspecting people to mimic the movements of the past. And anything that we've seen before will come back as pageantry to confuse and entertain us. We are in the middle of a massive indoctrination campaign, a global shift in economics and in culture. We are being muzzled and kept apart while we're told that we're all in this together. We're also told that masking ourselves and socially isolating from others is for our own good and the good of society, and that we're selfish and putting others at risk if we don't go against our own human nature. We are experiencing a confusing and deliberate manipulation of society to pit people against each other, to break apart any cohesion we once had in order to build up something new, something that will level the playing field, making everyone except the very wealthy the same. The goal is to turn all of us into serfs, serving the ruling class. We've never experienced anything like this before, except we have, but only from a distance. In the past, the U.S. has attacked other countries through economic war, color revolutions, and outright military action. These strategies and tactics are now coming home and being waged on all of us. We are now facing our own color revolution. This is not communism, Nazism, or any sort of religion. This is authoritarianism in a form never seen before. This is communitarianism. This is the fourth industrial revolution.
And it matters whether individual empowerment is tied to a vision of common advancement or not. It matters not whether we're right or left, but whether we are communitarian or not, whether we believe that fundamentally societies and eventually global movements must rise or fall together.
Humanity is now under attack. This attack is not from the far left or the far right. It's from the extreme center. The political philosophy of the UN and the World Economic Forum, Communitarianism, is behind the Sustainable Development Initiatives as well as the Agenda for the 21st Century and Agenda 2030. It's also behind the Strategic Intelligence Platform of the World Economic Forum. In other words, billionaires and world leaders are forcing us into a community that we're not really part of. They're changing our lives and the world that we live in using a philosophy that no one has ever heard of. In its most bland description of itself, and there is plenty of self-described content out there, communitarianism is considered a political or social philosophy. According to Encyclopaedia Britannica, communitarianism emphasizes the importance of community in the functioning of political life, in the analysis and evaluation of political institutions, and in understanding human identity and well-being. Although communitarianism started in the 19th century and was largely a very obscure and different philosophy than it is today, it continued into the 20th century with adherents like Martin Buber, who was more of a humanitarian and closely linked to the anarchist movement.
Contemporary communitarianism started to take form in the 1980s as a critique of the two major tendencies of liberal democracy: liberalism, which seeks to protect and enhance personal autonomy and individual rights, in part through political engagement via the government, and libertarianism, which aims to protect individual rights and property through strict limits on governmental power.
I do think there's a real problem that communitarianism actually tries to deal with the poor by coercing them and controlling them. What we need to talk about is social justice and fairness. What does communitarianism do to people who feel that they're outside the community or excluded from it? It has very little to say to them.
Communitarianism is politically centrist and linked to neoliberalism. Contemporary politicians like Bill and Hillary Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Howard Dean, and Barack Obama all identify as communitarian. Given the policies and ethics of these politicians, this is a good illustration of how communitarianism is formed, transmitted, justified, and enforced into society. The policies of these politicians and communitarianism are often promoted as being for the common good, when in fact they take away the rights of citizens, hurt the impoverished, and polarize society. Like New Age religion, communitarianism pulls bits and pieces of ideas and practices from different political philosophies, which show up here and there, which is why it often feels squishy and hard to pin down. Although it tends toward leftist ideologies, there are plenty of authoritarian attitudes from the right that emerge as well, especially when it comes to enforcing policies on the majority population by a minority group of stakeholders. Contemporary communitarianism promotes the group over the individual. It speaks in beige, feel-good corporate language and uses words and phrases that sound good, but are usually the opposite of what you think they are.
Communitarianism is that concept, that social and political construct that says that the individual's rights should be balanced against the rights of the community. And of course, the community is that amorphous, undefined community that we, when we talk about community, we think we're, of course, part of it and that, it's a positive thing. But really, community is constructed. It's constructed of non-governmental organizations, corporations, and government in order to dictate and regulate what it is that happens around the world. And we, as individuals, have literally no influence on that unless we are in agreement with it.
Decisions and policies are not necessarily made by the government, but instead developed by the community. But the community isn't you, me, or our neighbors. Community is made up of multi-stakeholder coalitions, or public-private partnerships, which is essentially the definition of fascism. These coalitions, also known as the third sector, are made up of stakeholders. Stakeholders are representatives of governments, civil society organizations, corporations, non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, nonprofit organizations, and social movement organizations. The decisions and policies created by these stakeholders do not include ordinary citizens per se. If you are not among the representatives of these groups, then you aren't part of the conversation or the policies that are developed. There is no direct democracy, nor any representative democracy. There is only the community making decisions about how things should be done, the behavior of society, and how people should live. The biggest problem that critics have from the left and from the right have been the willingness of communitarianism to override guaranteed individual rights and liberties in favor of the common good.
Communitarians argue that attention also must be paid to the role of civil society and not to individuals. They believe that social behavior should be influenced and regulated by the community. As a result, a small percentage of people within the group of decision makers can have more influence on society and dictate how people behave, where and how they live, where they work, move around or play, and how children are educated and cared for. An individual person has no recourse to address their issues or opinions. What matters is what the community thinks, and if there is an opinion, method, or direction that is counter to the community, that's too bad. That person or group of people who don't have the influence of the third sector multi-stakeholder coalition can be deplatformed, shunned, and silenced by a small percentage of people influenced by decision makers to publicly shame and ostracize heretics. The communitarian solution to wealth inequality and deep-seated poverty is not wealth redistribution or even true meritocracy. Instead, communitarianism deflects the issue by talking in broad terms about equity and equality, or will use identity politics as a means to distract people from the issue of poverty, which, as we've pointed out, is often used to keep poor people divided and in turn foments racism. As far as answers for ending poverty are concerned, the communitarian solution is to push all of us into entrepreneurship, but communitarian entrepreneurship looks more like the gig economy than true self-employment. It offers the opportunity to compete on the global market through digital product service platforms, where the playing field appears level, but it isn't, because it favors those best suited for marketing themselves to an online audience at a competitive rate with race-to-the-bottom pricing. These platforms also allow others to make money from our work as agents to connect us to customers. This is not self-employment, nor is it self-empowerment. This is still working for others under the guise of working for ourselves, and it's fraudulent. What was it Barack Obama kept talking about in his 2008 campaign? Hope and change? Well, all hope really is a false expectation and takes away from your agency. And change? Whose change? Did his change really change anything? It did help wealthy bankers become wealthier. It did take away more civil and human rights and constitutional protections from United States citizens, which opened the door for authoritarian policies that we're seeing right now and bound to see more of in the coming weeks, months, or years. And he did all that while using the feel-good language that made people trust him and love him to this day, while ignoring the knife in their back. So, despite their values and their desire to keep us safe and together and to make the world, a better place, the communitarians are actually imposing their ideas, improvement, and change on the rest of us. for another reason. And that reason is not to improve society or the environment or whatever they're marketing at the moment. What they're doing is all about making money and lots of it, and that money will not be shared with us. Some of it will be paid out to the sycophantic toadies of the centrist professional class, but ultimately, the money that is made from us and our oppression is for the billionaires who drive these agendas and keep us under control.
It's now been 3 months since the COVID lockdowns in the US. As we have stated before, in all that time, legacy systems have been taken down and new systems are being put in their place. Along with economic, commercial, and interpersonal relationships, our political systems are being changed right under our noses. And during that time, we have also been tested to see if we go along with what's being done. Masks are muzzles that teach us to obey and to keep quiet. They also disguise our faces so that we no longer relate to each other as humans, but at the same time teach the recognition software, combined with AI technology, how to recognize us even when we cover our faces. Social distancing has pushed us away from one another and made us afraid to be near other people. These have been tested to see how we respond, and we have done well, passing our tests, receiving good grades. Despite only around 10% of the population really pushing the narratives surrounding these measures, most of the population went along because those narratives were so compelling. Now that the goals of all those lies have been met and the story is starting to unravel, the rest of the population is questioning the narrative and pushing back. People are resisting the masks and the social distancing and everything else asked of them. But the propaganda machine is responding with more lies and denouncements of those people who dare question the narrative. But again, these are tests to see how we respond and what action we might take. The collected data from these tests will most likely inform those people implementing these tests, and that data will be used to counter our future responses when new events and actions are rolled out. In all the resistance, people turn to old systems that they were familiar with. This, of course, is natural, especially if you don't know that everything is changing. But the political systems that allowed us to respond democratically won't hold up next time. Our liberties or individual rights are being challenged, and unless we do something now to confront the changes taking place, the so-called new normal will become normal, and there will be nothing the majority of people can do to change things.
The reason it's important to point this out and to highlight the fact that only a small percentage of the population held on to the narrative and led all of us along is because in communitarianism, politics are no longer about individual rights or majority rule. What matters most is the opinion of the community. And as we've pointed out, the community is not made up of individuals discussing ideas, promoting opinions, or voting one way or another on what should be done. Instead, the community is made up of pre-configured groups coming together to discuss and decide what should be done. But as we've stated in our introduction to this series, multi-state coalitions sound democratic, but they aren't. Multi-state coalitions, like all multi-stakeholder governance, is not about a voted-in representative representing your interests. And it's certainly not direct democracy, or any sort of democracy for that matter. If you look at how this works politically, it only takes a small group to sway the rest of the people into going along with their plan, solution, or agenda. In the last 3 months, the small group pushing the agenda has been the exemplar of how we should behave and what we should do. The media took that message, amplified it so that the message was so pervasive and so impenetrable that it was hard to question. For those of us who did question that narrative, we found ourselves on the outside of the group or public opinion. We all felt confused and frustrated with the lack of logic or sense, and ultimately we became angry for being questioned, shamed, blamed, and shunned. We have seen all of this play out in the last few months. Public shaming or blaming or shunning has been the norm for people who dare not wear a mask in public or go outside when they're not supposed to. How often did you see the message? Is this trip essential?
In addition to all that, the weird phrases and slogans during the protests against police brutality and racism are being used against ordinary people, and used to the point that one cannot defend themselves. The whole point of promoting a phrase like silence is violence is to gaslight and scapegoat to keep people quiet and out of the public spectacle. It's an easy thing to say without really comprehending its meaning in the heat of the event. Like something out of Orwell's 1984 and the 2 Minutes of Hate. The phrases and words are hurled at a made-up enemy, except in our case, our society, our legacy systems are that enemy, and most of us don't even realize what we're demanding. That's because, once again, the small group is convincing, or rather coercing, the rest of us to go along. The events that are taking place, and the change being demanded, are inorganic, and they will continue. Today the focus is racism and defunding the police. Tomorrow it could be about mental health, or the disabled, or the LGBTQIA community. Whatever the theme of the event may be, it will not be good for those communities, or any of us, but it will be dressed up as positive change. A focus on mental health could mean disappearing those of us with a little depression or even anxiety through heavy sedation and drug regimens or outright institutionalization. It could mean hiding the disabled from our daily sight by keeping them separate and taking away the rights of individuals who don't fit the norm. It's really hard to tell.
If you go back and think about what has taken place in the last few months, it's all been about reprogramming us from being individuals to being a group, a community. But the communities we're becoming seem less tolerant of each other, and the demands being made don't reflect the positive aspects of humanity, only the negative ones. Why is that? Could it be that to push us together into a new way of relating to each other, the old way has to be completely forgotten? This is the stuff of reprogramming and indoctrination. This is what the military does to new recruits in order to gain a cohesive whole. But this is also what cults do to new recruits in order to gain control over the individual and maintain control of the group. And that's not to say community is bad, not always. In our opinion, community is good and very important. We think that collective action and collectives can be a positive way to take action and to be a way to achieve things that individuals cannot. But we also think that both the individual and the community they are a part of must be free in order to thrive and survive. Darwin talked about how species who cooperated survived. Survival of the fittest was a post-Darwin idea that pushed Western culture away from being a more social society to being a more individualistic one. And the weird thing about all this is that over the past century or so, our society has been pushed more and more towards individualism while shunning socialism or collectivism. But now we're being pushed, and pushed back hard, toward a more social existence. But this isn't the social society or the socialism of the past, although it does reflect the most negative versions of it, like East Germany and the Stasi state, or Mao's Red Guard and the Cultural Revolution. Maybe at this point you're still having a hard time grasping the philosophy of communitarianism. When we say the alleged priorities of the community are balanced against the rights of the individual, what we mean is that this philosophy's goals for you as individuals is to lose all of your rights in this post-COVID-19 communitarianistic world. If you are someone who gets sick from wearing a mask, or you have trouble breathing, then that's too bad. The claim under communitarianism is that your need to go mask-free is putting the entire population at risk. This means that companies who have mask policies in place are now saying they have more power than government recommendations or even HIPAA and disability rights and protections. If you have a garden in your backyard, you may get a citation to destroy it because, according to the managerial class, these are the people in your local municipality who may answer to corporate interests. Your garden goes against community standards, even if everyone in the community loves your garden and wants it to stay. Under communitarianism, your garden represents individuality and art, or self-empowerment. So it has to go, because you don't want anyone else to feel bad because they may not have the same vision as you. If you are a parent, your rights to have control and the final say in how your child is cared for or educated have been rescinded. In a communitarian philosophy, the idea of it takes a village is exploited and turned on its head. In this post-COVID-19 communitarian world, government bodies are asserting their right to remove your child from your home, claiming that it's good for the community. Communitarianism also seeks to blanch out the differences among us. We are all of different colors, cultures, sexual orientations, and backgrounds with our own unique talents and voices we offer the world. This rich diversity is what makes the world, but communitarianism wants to make it so that we are colorless, genderless, and that the difference among us are stomped out. The philosophy behind this is that it will shame you for speaking proudly about your experience as a black man or woman in this country, or it will shame you for sharing your empowering moment when you came out to your parents or transitioned into the gender you identify with. These experiences no longer matter in a communitarian world because we are all to exist in a society where no one stands out from anyone else. This is yet another reason why we are forced to wear the mask. Our most visible, unique parts of ourselves are mostly covered, and our human interaction and human connection is assaulted when the barrier covers who we really are. Communitarianism seeks to keep us all the same and equalized, but what this actually does is makes us more suspicious of one another. When we meet new people, we will always wonder if we've said or done the wrong thing, and we no longer trust ourselves to represent ourselves on the same level as everyone else. This trust factor is then broken down in individuals. This is the goal behind communitarianism, to break down trust in communities, starting with each person individually. Because strong communities that offer diverse commerce and ideas and open dialogue where we treasure and lift up our experiences, are communities that thrive outside the control of oppressive systems. This dangerous philosophy seeks to overtake your constitutional protection of freedom to assemble or freedom to worship. The philosophy of communitarianism, coming to fruition in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, has no room for religion. Religion, at times, offers historical perspective and gives us parables and examples of the past to follow, so we don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again. But when your right to worship is balanced against a philosophy that supports a one faith, unified agenda, then that has echoes of fascism. Perhaps you will one day be able to assemble in your church again, but your congregation has to come together under this new post-COVID-19 philosophy of communitarianism, where trust is broken, where people are suspicious of each other, and where your faith is now practiced under a philosophy that has overtaken it. When these philosophical methods are waged pervasively and constantly against an individual, and the constant message of "do this for your community or else" is pummeled at you from the ad campaigns that filter your news feed, to commercials on television, to what your child learns in school, then what it does is it suspends your natural ability to reason and make decisions grounded in logic. Your amygdala, the portion of your brain that exists as intuition to protect you from danger, is attacked endlessly through these highly coercive, curated, and destructive trauma-based campaigns. Thus, you essentially become an individual enslaved to an outside philosophy. Communitarianism is not communism. It is not Marxism. It is fascism. But unlike fascism, which seeks to simply control, communitarianism seeks to reach into a human being, scramble the very thing that makes them human, and force them to re-emerge as a controlled entity. This forced push into the next phase of the evolution of the human mind or soul is not empowering, and it does not have anything to do with enlightenment or reaching our hidden strengths or potential. Its goal is oppression into slavery through coercion, trauma, gaslighting, and threats.
The social society we're being pushed into will involve a lot of surveillance and the spirit crushing of individuals who think differently than the group. The technological surveillance and control by the ruling class will primarily be used to control and financialize us, and the policing will be left up to privatized security to protect property or the state. But socially, we'll police ourselves by snitching on our neighbors and turning on the ones we love. There will not be a community of cooperative neighbors working together to achieve a common goal. We'll be dictated to via herd mentality and peer pressure, with initiatives and programs coming from a group that we don't belong to. We will have to bend to the will of a society that we may not agree with. And if we don't want that to happen, we need to do something about it now. The window of opportunity is closing, and closing fast. We don't have all the answers. None of us do. Ironically, though, we need to come together as groups, to band together to stop the tyranny. Those of us who don't like what's been going on, who prefer our liberties, are in the majority. Equally, we have to stop thinking in old ways, like the left-right divide, and how we were divided up before. This time, we have to work together with people who might have been our enemies before, for our common good and the future of our society. These people may have been our enemies before and may be our enemies in the future, but for now, we are all each other's allies and are the best way to ensure our freedom.
It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity. It's all about humanity. About humanity. It's all about humanity.